Chapter 6. After work on Fridays, the lads from Pigeon's MOT and Diagnostics all went for a drink at the King's Arms. They were a motley crew. Tall, silent Pavel, always with an exotic black cigarette in his mouth that made him look like an angry poet. Mikey, as pale as a pint of milk, with ice-blue eyes and hair of almost pure white on his head, brows, lashes, and legs. His negative was Ang, with his tan skin and jet-black hair and eyes. Ang couldn't buy a proper drink. He swore he was 20, but he had no ID to support his claim, and it would be years before he looked more than 16, so they'd long ago stopped trying to con the barman and just got drunk without him. Every time they did, Mikey got louder and Pavel got darker, while Ang joined in by laughing at jokes he didn't understand, even if they were at his expense. James got drunk too. With every beer, he could do a better impression of a young man whose wife still loved him, and who hadn't lost his son. Sometimes, through the blur of the beer, he could barely see his own cracks. But it took a lot of blurring. Mikey had his leg propped on a chair and was showing his curly white shins to two giggling women. "Is it white everywhere?" one of them said, predictably, and they both giggled like mad at their own daring. "White as ice cream," leered Mikey. "If you're lucky, I'll show you me 99. They shrieked and clutched each other and swigged their vod bombs. "You girls are gorgeous," said Mikey. "Especially you." He pointed at both of them and they roared with laughter. He'd take them both home tonight. James would have put his next pay packet on it. Mikey was no oil painting. Hell, he was barely a finger painting. But he had the swagger of a man twice his age, and girls were putty in his fluffy white hands. The kind of girls who drank vod bombs, anyway. James stared down into the dregs of his third pint and wondered whether it was worth going on, or if he should just stop and save the money. Take Anna to the movies, maybe. He snorted into the glass. They hadn't been to the movies since before Daniel was born. So he finished his drink and got up to get another. It had been a bad week, and he needed the blur. The bar was 3 people deep, all waving their 20s at the sweaty staff. James stood and waited, letting the noise and the heat fill his head, pushing out any thinking he might do, any guilt. Slowly he became aware of Mikey's voice above the hubbub. "And him over there, so feck you too if you think you're hard enough." James turned slowly to look over his shoulder. Mikey could start a fight in an empty room, but on this occasion he was still in his chair, pointing him out to 3 clean-cut young men. They were in good shoes and neat but casual shirts, but James could see that the leader had a tattoo on his neck, low enough to be hidden by a collar and tie. He couldn't be sure, but he thought it was a swastika. Although Mikey and Pavel hadn't got up, James noticed that Mikey had placed his pint on the windowsill, out of harm's way, and Pavel had rested his cigarette on the edge of the table, which for him was tantamount to loading an Uzi. Ang was on the edge of his seat, his dark eyes drawing rapid triangles between Mikey, the men, and the door. He twitched, as if to get up, and Pavel put a big hand on his forearm, forcing him to stay put. James couldn't blame him for wanting to run. Ang had been beaten up a couple of times. Only a few months ago Brian had sent him off to Friar Tuck's for lunch, and he'd returned with a split lip, a swollen eye, and the tattered remains of cod and chips 5 times, with extra gravel. But sometimes you had to make a stand. James straightened up, and the man with the tattoo looked him up and down. James could almost watch him think. Now it was 4 against 3, although Ang barely counted. James wasn't big, but he was an extra pair of fists, while Pavel was tall and unafraid, and Mikey looked like an enthusiast, even with the leg of his jeans rolled up. James felt relief in his gut. Nothing was going to happen, and nothing would have, if Ang had held his nerve. But he made a sudden break for it, twisting off his chair and diving into the Friday night crowd. It stopped him like a wall, and in a second they were on him, and James and Pavel and Mikey were on them, and a dozen lads who'd been preparing all night for a fight, any fight, joined in on any side that would have them. It was the first fight James had been in for years. But by the time someone shouted that the police were coming, he had cleared a space around himself, and a circle of people were regarding him warily. The three young men were nowhere to be seen. Someone tugged at his sleeve, and he knocked them away and turned to fight whoever it was. "Whoa there!" It was Mikey, ducking a bit. "Come on," he added urgently. "Let's go out the back." "Where's Ang?" said James, and Ang and Pavel appeared as if by magic. They were all a little dishevelled, and Ang's lip was split, but they were all in one piece. "Thanks a bunch," Ang panted sincerely. "Thanks a fucking bunch." They started laughing then. Partly Ang's words and partly the adrenaline high of having fought and survived. James led them giggling around the bar, starting to jog. By the time they passed the toilets, they were running full pelt and laughing, and he hit the back door so hard he almost took it off its hinges. It was raining outside, but nothing could dampen their spirits. Not even the kegs that Pavel knocked over, or the rusted nail that dug into Ang's hand. All of it was just hilarious, now they weren't dead. Looking down the alleyway alongside the pub, they could see the flickering lights of a police car. So they turned round, following the high wall along the back of the yard. A train passed under the bridge, and James pulled himself up the wall high enough to watch its curved, wet roof disappear into the darkness. "Yeah!" he shouted after it. "Yeah!" "Nutter," laughed Mikey. "Motherfucker," laughed Ang, and the other three looked at each other in surprise. Then James said, "Morty, Vicar?" And they all laughed so hard that Mikey actually cried, and they all had to shush each other constantly, so the police wouldn't find them here, behind the bins that smelled of chip fat and gangrene. When they stepped out of the alleyway, it was into the crowd that had emptied from the front door of the King's Arms, illuminated in slow blue flickers by the lights of the police cars. Mikey whistled for a taxi, and he and Pavel climbed into it. They lived in the other direction from the garage. "You okay?" said Mikey. "Yeah, mate," said James. "Bloody brilliant." "You're a nutter," said Mikey, in a voice that sobered James up, because it didn't sound like Mikey was joking. He was looking at him hard, and James wiped his mouth on the back of his hand in case he had blood there, or food even though he hadn't eaten a thing. "What?" he said. "Nothing," said Mikey. "Maybe get some peas for your hands." "Yeah, I will," said James, although he didn't know what the hell Mikey was talking about. Mikey was the nutter, everyone knew that. They all said good night and fuck off and up yours, and then Mikey saw the two girls from earlier in the pub and called them over, and James and Ang watched as, somehow, he charmed them both into the cab and drove off across Bickley Bridge. "Unbelievable," said James. "Shit," said Ang. They walked the short way to the garage together, both hunched against the rain. Ang peeled off and started patting his pockets. "Got the keys?" James hoped he did, because otherwise he would have to take him home with him and Anna would be angry. They used to have Ang up for supper all the time, and on cold nights he would stay on the sofa. But now Anna wouldn't have anyone in the flat because of the germs. James suspected that even he wouldn't be welcome, if he wasn't the one paying the rent. Ang never said anything about it, and the only time James had tried to explain, he'd just nodded and smiled and said, "Is good," as if he had never wanted a decent meal or a warm sofa in the first place. Ang took the garage keys from his pocket and dangled them at James. James opened his own front door just a few yards away, and they both raised a hand in goodbye. James closed the door behind him, never without thinking of Daniel, and took off his boots. He winced as his knuckles protested at being asked to perform intricate maneuvers like pulling on a lace. Only then did he remember what Mikey had said about the peas. Frozen peas, to take the swelling down. He went up the stairs and opened the door of the freezer compartment. It was small, and made smaller by the overgrowth of ice around its entrance. There were no frozen peas, just an empty ice tray and half a box of fish fingers. James took them out and stared at the box. Fish fingers were Daniel's favorite. He put them back. "Anna," he said loudly, "we got any peas?" She didn't answer. It didn't matter. Where would they be if they weren't in the freezer? And if they were anywhere but the freezer, they were no good to him. He shook his head. With the open fridge cooling his thighs, James spread his hands on the counter. They were red and swollen, and one knuckle had 2 short cuts on it, right alongside each other, as if Bugs Bunny had nipped him. He must have hit something very hard or very often to have got them into this state. He couldn't remember whether it was one or the other or both, but he felt a lot better for it. He knelt slowly in front of the fridge and pushed both his hands into the freezer compartment. The overgrown ice pressed around him coldly. "Anna!" he said again, but she was ignoring him. He rested his head on the top of the fridge, and only woke up when melting ice trickled slowly up his sleeve, all the way into his armpit. He got up and shut the door. Such a simple thing to do. And went into the bedroom. It was only then that James realized with a shock that, for the first time in 4 months, Anna wasn't home. Chapter 7. The man who'd been seen on TV was a big disappointment. Richard Latham was stocky and middle-aged, wearing thick glasses and beige slacks, and when he walked onto the small raised plinth that was supposed to be a stage, he bounced along on his tiptoes, with the exaggerated gait of a puppet on strings. Anna thought there must be something wrong with his feet or his legs. It was comical, but it was also a little bit disturbing. He tapped the microphone and then bent backwards a little to look up at the ceiling. "Can you hear me?" he said. An amused ripple ran through the small audience. There were maybe 15 people in total gathered together in the Bickley Spiritualist Church, which was a grubby little hall next to the King's Arms. There were bars at the high windows, plastic chairs instead of pews, and fake flowers in a vase, lilies and irises gathering dust. On the wall behind the plinth was a clock that had stopped at 6:15, and a small apologetic crucifix. None of it calmed Anna's nerves. She had taken nearly an hour just to get past the 5 footprints. She'd chickened out and gone back inside 4 times, hot and panicky, despite the cold and damp, before finally making a run for it, hurtling down the uneven pavement with the baby jiggling and bouncing in his buggy. Just being outdoors had been enough to make her nervous. Now that she'd seen the dusty flowers, being indoors was making her nervous too. The carpet was threadbare and crumbly, and nobody but her had left their shoes in the porch. She tried not to imagine the germs, but her eyes already felt gritty. She leaned forward and pulled the rabbit fleece almost up to Charlie's eyes, so that the dust couldn't settle in his nose or mouth. She almost wished she hadn't brought him, but leaving him at home would have been worse. Better let him be exposed to the dirty air and filthy flowers than left with James. James couldn't be trusted with children. The woman sitting next to Anna leaned over and peered into the buggy. "Oh, isn't he lovely?" Anna nodded and smiled through stiff lips. She wished the woman would get her face away from the buggy, Her hair was too blonde and permed to within an inch of its sticky life, and she was wafting chemicals and germs all over him. "What's his name?" Charlie." She'd almost said Daniel. It would have felt so good to use his name in a normal way instead of a way that shredded her heart. "Oh," the woman said again. "Look at him blowing his little bubbles." A train rumbled under the bridge below them, and Anna thought of the 8:20 from Victoria. She felt that old desperation fluttering upwards in her, like a bus ticket in a sudden gust, and had to slam a door on the feeling. She couldn't think of that. She couldn't think of the drop to the rails and the oblivion of the train. She had to stay strong if she was ever going to find Daniel. Although the thought of finding him here made her want to cry. She bit her lip and tried to focus on the man on the stage. Knowing would be better than not knowing. Perhaps. "Good evening," the man said. "I'm Richard Latham. Some of you may have seen me on TV." Two plump women in the front row nodded vigorously, and Latham winked and said, "The camera adds £10, you know. I used to be a large, now I'm just a medium." There were a couple of minor chuckles, and the blonde woman leaned into Anna and hissed, "He said that last week, too, and he was only on TV a few times. Then they took him off." This wasn't how Anna had thought it was going to be, and that was good. She'd thought it might be frightening, or stupidly mystical, or like the school fair fortune-teller she'd been to once as a child. Mrs. Smart, the geography teacher, wrapped in a tablecloth and foretelling that she'd get an A if she worked very, very hard. Richard Latham suddenly pointed at her and said, "I've someone here for you, sir." Anna flinched. Then she looked to her right and realized that Latham must be cross-eyed to add to his other shortcomings. He meant the skinny young man sitting beside her in a bulky silver puffer jacket that was several sizes too large for him. His head protruded from its huge padded collar like a nodding dog's. To add to the illusion, he nodded. "Someone called Beryl. Can you take that for me, sir?" "Yes," nodded the young man. "Is it definitely Beryl?" "Yes," he said. "Beryl." "And is she your grandmother?" "No, she was my grandmother's neighbour, but I knew her really well." "Okay," said Latham, and cocked his head at the ceiling. Anna followed his gaze nervously, but there was just a long cobweb there, and a damp patch in the shape of Australia. "Okay," he said again. "Beryl says to tell your gran it's all wine and roses up here. Wine and bloomin' roses, Mary. What's your gran's name?"
"Marie."
"Oh, Marie, wine and blooming roses. That's her words, you see, not mine. Nobody says blooming nowadays, do they?" He looked at the ceiling again, and this time Anna noticed she wasn't the only person observing Australia along with him. "Anything else?" said Latham, and waited. Then he said, "No. That's all there is from Beryl."
"Thank you,"
said the young man. He didn't look a bit surprised to have had a message from a dead woman, didn't rush off to phone his grandmother, didn't whip out a notebook to write down the message while it was fresh in his memory. He also didn't burst into flames for dabbling in the spirit world. Anna didn't believe in God anymore, but she felt a little relieved by that anyway. Richard Latham looked thoughtful again, and Anna felt herself tensing so hard that she began to shake. But he pointed to a very frail old man on the end of the front row, who sat with both hands clamped over the knob of a gnarled walking stick. He had huge ears, each containing a large pink plastic hearing aid. "I've got someone here for you, sir, and she's very angry. Must be the wife, the old man quavered, and everybody laughed heartily. She says the doctor gave you a prescription, sir. Is that right? The old man hesitated. Then he said, Maybe. Don't you maybe me, said Latham sharply. Then he softened his tone and added, That's what she's saying, sir. I'm not being rude to you, honestly. She's saying, Don't you maybe me, young man. Here Latham stopped and looked puzzled. No offense, sir, but I wouldn't describe you as a young man. Are you sure this message is for you? The old man nodded. I was younger than her, see? Ah, said Latham. A toy boy. The old man cackled and nodded, and Latham cocked his head again, this time putting one hand momentarily alongside his ear, not quite cupping it, but close to it, as if the old man's dead wife was shouting from the back of the hall. Well, he continued, I don't want to be rude, young man, but your wife, is her name Ellen? Ella? Ella, said the old man. Well, Ella tells me you need to take that medicine, because they're not ready for you yet, you see. She says, you've still got a little way to go, and you might as well be healthy and happy while you're waiting. Will you do that for her, sir? Will you do that for Ella? The old man ruminated, and Anna could hear his dentures clicking from the back row. I'm not ordering you, sir, said Latham gently. I'm only passing on a message. I'll think about it, said the old man. Good, said Latham. But she's still a bit cross. Everyone laughed again, and the old man flapped a hand and said, Oh, all right then, just to shut her up. This was nothing like Anna had expected it to be. Now, said Latham, I'll let someone else have a go. To Anna's surprise, the young man in the puffer jacket got up and walked to the front of the room and took the microphone from Latham. What's happening now? Anna couldn't resist asking the blonde woman. It's open circle, she said. We're all here to learn. Learn what? Psychic powers. Oh, said Anna. The idea that you could learn to be psychic was both stupid and intriguing. The young man was frowning hard at the wall, waggling the microphone absent-mindedly. Right, he said finally. I've got a Neville here. Neville or Nigel. There was an undercurrent of non-interest, and then a young woman just in front of Anna raised her hand. I can take a Nigel. Good, said the man, and thought a bit more. This Nigel, was he very fat? No, said the woman, very thin. Richard Latham got up and stood beside the young man, offering advice. Now be a bit more confident, don't be rushed. Wait until you're sure, and then don't ask the person, tell them what you see. That way you'll get better results, and not waste time with the wrong people. The young man nodded like a plastic pug on a parcel shelf, and took some more time staring at the wall. Before he could say anything else, a man with a port wine birthmark on his cheek put up his hand and said, I could take a fat Neville. I only just remembered my father-in-law. He was a right porker. And so it went on. Ghosts leaving messages on spiritual answering machines, as if they'd popped out to the shops rather than died. One by one, random people stood under the damp patch and channeled the dead. It was all so normal. If Anna had expected anything, it would have been, the will is under the bathroom carpet and Marjorie did it and hid the knife in the shed. Instead, there was Carol remembering her blue felt slippers, John telling his brother to repair the chimney before winter, and Granny Mitchell confirming that Gramps had arrived safely and was as happy as a Sam boy. As every would-be psychic got up, Anna's stomach fluttered with nerves. but the longer Daniel failed to put in an appearance, the less frightened and more relieved she got. He wasn't dead. He couldn't be dead. If he was dead, he'd have come here and let her know, surely. The tension drained from her, and she felt exhausted. If it hadn't been a sort of church, she might have left to go home to bed. As it was, she felt obliged to sit and listen as the dead droned on. Her astonishment at their messages left her fast, and was replaced by a vague suspicion. Finally, she was just bored. Dead people were every bit as dull as the living. She felt her eyelids droop and hid a yawn. She put a foot on a strut of the buggy and moved it gently back and forth, to keep herself awake as much as to keep the baby asleep. By the time they got to the free tea and biscuits, Anna only stayed because she hadn't eaten all day, and was determined to get her 2 quid's worth. She helped herself to a cup of weak tea and 2 bourbon biscuits, because that was all there was. The blonde woman who'd been beside her on the plastic chairs sat down next to her again. She had nice clothes and perfect makeup, and a bag that matched her shoes. It stood out among the anoraks and jeans. "I'm Sandra," she smiled, and before Anna could stop her, she had her head back under the hood of the buggy and was breathing all over the baby. She sat up again and smiled. "He's very good, isn't he?" "Yes," said Anna, "he's very good." But he wasn't Daniel, and she didn't love him the same way she had loved Daniel. That didn't mean she wouldn't do all she could to keep him safe from harm, and that included germs. She leaned into the buggy herself so that Sandra could not, and rearranged the blankets. The baby's hand had fallen out and was cold, and she tucked it back in. Then she put her foot back on the axle and resumed the gentle back-and-forth rocking that kept babies so quiet. "He your only one?" said Sandra. "No," said Anna. "Daniel's 4. Nearly 5 now. I don't have children. Couldn't. Blocked tubes, you know." "I'm sorry," said Anna, and she was. "Oh, well," said Sandra. "We all have our crosses to bear." She smiled, then said, "Is this your first time here?" "Yes." "What do you think?" Anna looked around to give herself time. Australia caught her eye. "I'm not sure," she said. "Don't be put off by the grotty hall and the carpet," said Sandra in a low voice. "Richard's a proper shut-eye." "What's a shut-eye?" said Anna. "A shut-eye is for real. An open eye just pretends." "Pretends what?" "Pretends to have the gift, talking to the dead and all that." "Why would someone pretend?" "To rip people off, of course," said Sandra. "But Richard's not like that," she added quickly. "He's a proper shut-eye, especially with dogs." "Dogs?" said Sandra, and rummaged in her bag. "He has a marvellous record communicating with dogs. People swear by him." She took out a thick pile of photographs. "This is Mitzi," she said, handing one to Anna. "She won top puppy." Anna said, "Wow," although she had no idea whether that was something to be admired or not. Sandra went on. "Richard likes to work from a photograph." "A photograph?" "Oh, yes. He looks at the photo and he just knows things. Things only the dog would know. It's like magic." Magic indeed. Anna had seen magicians on the telly. You couldn't see how they performed their illusions, but she knew that that was all they were. Sleight of hand and smoke and mirrors. Not real. Sandra seemed sad and a little bit crazy. Anna looked doubtfully at the picture. It had been taken outdoors, somewhere on grass, and Sandra was wearing a beige belted safari jacket that made her look like a chubby Swedish commando. She was holding a small apricot poodle, almost hidden by a big red rosette. Behind them, Anna could see a blue line that she assumed was the rope edge of some kind of show ring, and a short row of blurred people in the act of clapping, which was a strange thing, caught in suspended animation. Anna shivered, even though the hall was not cold. Sandra leaned in conspiratorially.
Most people come here to get messages from their relatives, but dead people are so dreary.
Anna laughed, then quickly stopped. She hadn't laughed for a long, long time, and it felt sharp and guilty in her mouth.
Have you ever had a message from your dog?
Oh, yes, said Sandra.
Almost every time I come.
What kind of things?
All sorts. Richard tells me things that only I would know. Like exactly how she used to give a little bark when she wanted a treat, and how she'd put her head on one side, like this, when I talked to her. And she did those things, you see. He's ever so good. And he gives me messages from her, too. I love you. I miss you.
Sandra's eyes brimmed with sudden tears, and she held her forefingers under her eyes to stop them spilling over and ruining her perfectly applied mascara. Anna felt the burn of empathy behind her own eyes, even though she had lost her son, and Sandra was only missing a dead dog. Sandra found a well-used tissue in her bag and blew her nose discreetly.
Do you have to pay him?
Who?
Richard. I don't have to. I make donations to the Church Roof Fund. That's only fair, isn't it? I have a private reading after the service. What Richard does takes time and saps his spiritual energy. But he's not in it for the money. No real shut-eye is.
Anna nodded, but she glanced up at Australia. It had always been her experience that everybody was in everything for the money, apart from James, which was why they never had any, of course. She offered the photo to Sandra, but she said,
You keep that. I have loads of them. My phone number's on the back.
While Sandra tucked the rest of the photos back into her bag and hooked it over her chair, Anna watched Richard Latham. He was sitting a few yards away with the two ladies who'd seen him on TV, while a half-dozen other people stood around him, listening intently, teacups in hand. Anna tuned in to what he was saying. "So I went to her house in L.A., Latham told them, and I said, 'Come on, Marilyn, you're dead.' And I grabbed her by the hand and I pushed her through the door to the other side." There were murmurs of approval as Latham took a long slurp of tea. Anna noticed he had biscuit crumbs down the front of his jumper. "Some people don't know they're dead, you see, so you have to tell them." Everyone nodded, and there were rumors of true and "that's right," and Anna shied away from a new mental image of the soul lost between life and death, alone and afraid and never seeing a friendly face, in this world or the next. She couldn't think about it. It was worse than mere death. It made her hope that Richard Latham was a liar and a fake, and she comforted herself with the thought that if he really was psychic, he'd be in Hollywood by now, making millions off celebrities, dead or alive, not inventing outlandish stories about them in a grubby hall on Bickley Bridge. She turned to Sandra.
"What was he on TV for?"
Sandra dabbed tea from the corner of her mouth with the same tissue with which she'd blown her nose. It couldn't be hygienic. Anna moved the buggy away from her.
"He helped the police on a missing persons case."
Anna's heart lurched.
"A girl called Edie Evans," Sandra went on. "They found her bike all mangled somewhere over in Bromley. It was a year or so ago. Do you remember?"
Anna shook her head slowly, and her ears thrummed with blood. She felt drunk, yet more alert than she'd ever been in her life. So alert that she felt the tiny, soft hairs on the edges of her ears tingle in anticipation.
Did they Did they ever find her? I'm not sure. But they didn't find her body? Oh, no, I'd have remembered that.
Anna put her hand over her heart and felt it pulsing crazily under the skin.
Sandra, is your dog dead?
The words spilled out of her so urgently that she wasn't even sure they were in the right order.
Is Sandra Dog your dead? Oh, no, said Sandra, just lost. And Richard says she'll be home very, very soon.
They didn't have to be dead for the psychic to find them. Something expanded so fast in Anna's chest that it took her breath away. It was a magical bubble that left her dizzy and tearful with forgotten joy. This was why she was here. This was the reason she had left the safety of the flat and brought the baby out into the filth of a London night. This was why she'd ventured past the footprints on the edge of the cement, not to speak to the dead, but for this. For something Anna thought had been lost to her forever. For hope. Chapter 8. The body was small, but it wasn't light. He dragged it and lifted it and dragged it some more. The dragging felt wrong, not only because his hands were sweaty and kept slipping from around the narrow wrists, but because there was no dignity in it. Not for him, and not for the corpse. He picked it up and carried it. He tried to be kind to it. That's all he'd ever tried to be. And if he had failed in life, then it didn't mean he couldn't try to make amends in death. They were not separate things. He had lived with the dead for most of his life, and understood that. Just because a body no longer contained a spirit, it didn't mean it should be treated with anything less than kindness and respect. Even while he was trying to push it up and over the high railings, he should have wrapped it in something. It was too late now. One loose fist swung gently as he struggled. He clenched his teeth. Rain ran into his eyes as he heaved. His back cried out, his arms ached. He could feel the muscles stretching, trembling, and starting to wobble. The chiding fist bumped his cheek, reminding him. He dropped the body. It landed awkwardly in the damp grit, face down, and with the head twisted to the side under one hunched shoulder. The bare soles of the small feet glowing pale orange under the single street lamp. It was too hard. It was too horrible. He started to cry. He had failed the living, and now he was failing the dead. The rain on his face was swollen by sweat, and then by tears, and finally by snot as it ran over his lips and into his mouth in a salty flash flood of shame. Eventually he sighed and wiped his eyes on the damp sleeve of his shirt. Then he bent and embraced the body one more time. Chapter 9. Church? James frowned up at the ceiling. Neither of them had ever been to church. After Daniel had disappeared, because you left the door open. A priest had come round anyway and asked if he could help. Yes, Anna had said. You can post these flyers through every letterbox on Northborough Road. She'd held them out angrily, and the priest had taken them and smiled and said, of course, as if he was asked to deliver flyers all the time. And had done it, too. As far as James knew, it was the only time either of them had ever spoken to a man of the cloth. What church? He said. The one on the bridge. There's a church there? It's like a hall, but it's a church. Oh. What? Nothing, he said. Are you going again? Yes. He lay in silence for a moment, then got out of bed and started to dress. What's wrong? She said. He sat on the edge of the bed to put on his socks. You don't go out for months, and the first place you decide to go is a church? I went for Daniel, said Anna. James got up and took his T-shirt off the floor and pulled it over his head.
"I went for us,"
he snorted. "Leave me out of it."
"What do you mean?"
"Leave me out of it," he repeated. "I don't need you to go to church for me."
"But it's not—"
"I don't care what it's not," he said, suddenly angry. "I care what it is. And it's the last thing we need right now, or any time." Anna propped herself up on one elbow and watched him. James yanked open the wardrobe and started throwing random things at the bin bag in the corner that they used as a laundry hamper.
"What happened to your hands?" she said.
"Nothing."
"They're all swollen."
He didn't answer her, kept throwing clothes she knew were clean across the room. Anna picked at the edge of the duvet.
"We all need hope,"
she said softly. "I don't," he snapped, and looked at her properly for the first time that morning. "I don't need the kind of hope that's peddled by a church, Anna." He balled up a pair of jeans and hurled it hard at the bag. "Shit!" Then he turned on her angrily. "And I tell you what else I don't need. I don't need you sitting in the street like a crazy old monk. I don't need bloody refugees feeling sorry for me. I don't need the constant cleaning the house, and the stripping off and the taking off my boots in the hallway, and the guilt, and the no sex, and that fucking baby." Anna flinched. His face was in hers. The tendons stood out in his neck. He might hit her. He didn't. He stood up straight. "And the last thing I need is for you to get all religious on me."
"It's not—"
"Where was that bastard when Daniel disappeared? Eh? Where is he now? Nowhere. That's where God is. Not in a church, not in this house, not with us, and not with Daniel. Just fucking nowhere."
"It's not about God," she whispered.
"Good," he said. "Don't make it." He slammed the bedroom door so hard behind him that old paint flecked off the frame and spun silently to the floor. Anna let out a trembling breath and lay back down. The bed had cooled. It was a long time since it had been hot. Chapter 10. "Have a seat, Chief Inspector." Marvel knew something was wrong right there and then. Superintendent Robert Clyde was a taciturn man, and Marvel could match him monosyllable for monosyllable. Usually their interactions took place only in passing, unless they were critical to a case. Even then, Marvel always stood and updated the super from somewhere near the doorway, a distance they both apparently found comfortable. He had never before been offered a seat in his office. He went in and saw it from a new perspective. It wasn't much of an office. Just a cubbyhole with a door, a desk, 2 chairs, and a grubby little window that looked down on the roof of the Happy Kebabi next door. It explained why the super's office often smelled of old lamb. He scowled and sat down in a stained chair. From here he had a close-up of a wooden plaque on Clyde's desk, which from the door had always assumed was a nameplate. Now he saw it was a Bible quote. "It is time for the Lord to act, for your law has been broken." "I'm taking you off the Tansy Anderson case." "What?" Marvel bristled. Being taken off a case he was almost sure to solve was a kick in the teeth. "What for, sir?" "Scanlon can handle it. It's a no-brainer." Both of those things were true, but they hadn't answered Marvel's question, so he didn't ask another one. Just let the first one hang there, waiting. "I need you on another case," Clyde said finally. But he glanced past Marvel's shoulder as he spoke. Immediately Marvel knew 2 things. 1, that it was not a murder case, and 2, that Clyde was embarrassed to be asking. The first thing was bad, but the second was good. Really good. Superintendent Clyde was a cold fish, and Marvel could respect that quality. But ever since he had been transferred to Lewisham last Christmas to replace Superintendent Jeffries, It had been hard for Marvel to find a chink in the man's armor. And D.I. Marvel loved a chink. It was his unshakable view that everybody had a flaw in their makeup that allowed leverage to be exerted, and he liked to think he had a knack of identifying those weaknesses, those tiny human failings, that would give him the upper hand in any relationship. It was often race or affairs or homosexuality, but Marvel preferred the less obvious, less actionable. Like Craig Riley, one of G-Team's DCs. He had a disabled son and was always begging for time off for doctor's appointments, which meant that when he was at work, Marvel could give him the shittiest jobs with the longest hours, without fear of complaint. And Detective Sergeant Brady's chink was Argentinians. Colin Brady's father had been in the Falklands War and had taken Port Stanley, pretty much single-handedly if his son were to be believed. Now, 35 years on, Brady still fumed about Maradona's Hand of God goal every time Match of the Day came on, and his wife was banned from playing the soundtrack album to Evita, even through headphones. Argentinians, or anyone he suspected might be Argentinian, made D.S. Brady lose all reason, and he had to be steered away from them. Or towards them if Marvel thought it might be useful. Oh, what a circus. Everybody had something that Marvel could exploit to his own end. Superintendent Clyde, on the other hand, had so far appeared to be chink-free. But now that he was looking unsure about this other case, Marvel's antennae twitched. "Is it a murder case, sir?" Said Clyde, and Marvel sat up straighter. "No," the super continued carefully. "A disappearance." He handed Marvel a photograph of a buxom blonde woman with too much lipstick, sitting on a sofa. "What's her name?" Marvel asked. "Mitzi." "Mitzi what?" "Just Mitzi," said Clyde. "It's the dog that's missing." "The dog?" Marvel looked again at the photo. The blonde woman had a poodle on her lap. It was small and pale ginger, and had a pink bow on the top of its head. "My wife's dog," added Clyde, as if it made all the difference. Which it did, of course, thought Marvel, with a little bud of anger unfurling in his chest. Clyde was pulling him off a murder case to look for a lost dog. Shit, he thought. You shit. He was a murder detective, not a Cub Scout. What next? Would Superintendent Clyde have him shinning up trees to rescue cats? Opening a hedgehog hospital? Marvel didn't even like animals, any animals. And dogs, especially small fluffy ones with bows on their heads, were his most unfavourite animals of all. He cleared his throat. "And this is your wife, sir?" "Yes," said Clyde, looking uncomfortable at having to admit to something as human as a wife. "Sandra." Marvel nodded while his mind worked overtime to find the leverage. "The dog disappeared in the park," said Clyde, "while my wife was talking to a friend." "I see," said Marvel. "So is there a lead attached to it?" "No." Marvel nodded at the photo. "Collar?" "No." "Microchip?" "No." Clyde cleared his throat and made a stab at being in charge. "Listen, John," he said, and Marvel cringed inwardly at the use of his first name. It made him think of Debbie and his mother in the same mental breath, which was just wrong. "Listen, John, I know it's a bit out of the ordinary, but there's more to it than meets the eye. So I thought I'd put my best man on it, get it sorted, and get it over with." My best man? That stung like a salted slug. You didn't put your best man on the trail of a lost poodle. Marvel had to resist a sudden childish urge to tear the photograph into small pieces and toss them over his shoulder. Next. Instead, he stared at the photo of the wife and the dog, hoping for divine inspiration that might absolve him from the task at hand. He could call down the rulebook. He could call down his value to the Southeast's G-Team. He could call down the murder of Tansy Anderson, or any one of his unsolved cases. He could even call down Edie Evans on her Apollo 11 BMX. He should. He should call them all down, and nip this bollocks in the bud right here, right now. The dingy little office reverberated with tense silence. If Superintendent Clyde had had an ounce of pride, he would have told Marvel it was all a joke. And he'd almost had him. But what he actually said was, "Listen, John, she's driving me mad about the dog, day and bloody night. She's even been to see a bloody psychic." Marvel almost laughed. A wife, a poodle, and now a psychic? Out of nowhere. There was so much leverage in this that it would almost be criminal not to exploit it. Marvel wondered just how much he could get out of it. As much as a promotion? He'd only been a chief inspector for a couple of years, so it would be unusual to climb another rung of the ladder so soon. But not unheard of. And not unwelcome now he thought about it. His knees were starting to play up. And the thought of controlling a whole room of murder detectives, of having his finger in every pie, appealed to him. Not to mention getting more money and a fatter pension to sit on his arse behind a desk all day. Promotion was like committing a crime. You needed means, motive, and opportunity. And although Marvel reckoned he'd always have the means and the motivation, opportunity didn't always knock exactly when you needed it to. But it was knocking now, and he'd probably never get a simpler crack at promotion. Marvel had no illusions about his chances of promotion to superintendent, or his suitability. He wasn't a political animal, and knew he'd never be the first-choice candidate. DCI Lloyd would be the arse-creeper at the head of that queue, all things being equal. But in life all things were rarely equal, and the Metropolitan Police Force was no exception. Very often what was more important was a nod and a wink, and friends in high places. The superintendent was in a high place, and the psychic was the bow on the gift-wrapped, lever-shaped parcel he'd just been handed by his new friend, who was suddenly looking chinkier than chainmail. "I see your problem, sir," he nodded sympathetically. In the face of such sympathy, Clyde's superintendent of police facade momentarily slipped, and his real, haggard, haunted face was briefly revealed. "I'll not get any peace until that dog's found, John. Until it is, my life is going to be an utter bloody misery." Then, with a reverberating sigh, he looked Marvel straight in the eyes and added, "I'd be very grateful." And only because he was absolutely sure that that was true. Marvel nodded eagerly and said, "Don't worry, sir. I'll find it." Chapter 11. Anna Buck was on a mission. Often, after James left for work, she would slide back into sleep. That oblivion was such a temptation to her that sometimes the sound of a child crying was the only thing that could rouse her. Occasionally, in that netherworld between dreams and misery, the crying sounded so like Daniel that she would wake up, run into his room and stand there, naked and shaking beside his empty bed, as brutal reality slowly reclaimed her. It was a car horn, an ice cream van, the garage radio, or a dog wailing mournfully for its owner gone to work. But today, Anna swung her legs from under the duvet before sleep could reclaim her, quickly pulled on yesterday's clothes and changed, and fed Charlie with an unaccustomed air of urgency. The gas meter was in the cupboard under the stairs. On top of it was a short stack of 50p coins. The meter was secured with a padlock, but they never locked it because it was just them in the house. The landlord, Brian Pigeon, kept spares in the ground floor rooms, boxes and boxes and boxes. He had a spare front door key, but rarely came in. Anna twisted the padlock out of the metal loops on the meter and pulled open the little drawer, counting out the money in the sickly yellow glow of a low-wattage bulb. £32. Not as much as she'd hoped. She couldn't take it all, either, but she could turn off the heating, wear more jumpers, put another blanket on the baby. It would be warmer soon. Soon-ish. Maybe by the time the meter was read and the bill came in, she could have reduced their consumption so much that the shortfall would be negligible. Or maybe by the time the meter was read and the bill came in, Daniel would be home, and they wouldn't give a shit about being able to pay the gas bill, or about anything else that might ever go wrong in their lives again. She wondered how much Richard Latham charged for a consultation. She couldn't begin to imagine what something like that would cost, a token or a fortune. She should have asked Sandra. She took £25, 50 big coins bulging in her pockets and fists. It felt like a lot. In the kitchen, she put the coins in an old carrier bag and left it on the countertop. It gave her a thrill to look at it sitting there, waiting to change their lives, like a pouch of gold coins in a fairy tale. She thought about a beanstalk stretching from this world to the next, connecting the two, allowing passage between them. She decided to have a cup of tea and think about what Richard Latham might tell her. She didn't often entertain fantasies about Daniel's return, because it was too painful when they ended. But this felt different, exciting, and she decided to indulge herself just for 5 minutes before cleaning the flat. As she filled the kettle at the kitchen sink, she peered out onto the footprints. 5 dark smudges across the yellow-grey forecourt. Her lips tightened as a boy in baggy jeans rode his bike over them. There was nothing she could do about things like that. Nothing. Not without a bazooka. She wished she could build a barrier around the prints, or stay out there all day guarding them. But she had the house to clean, and a new baby to look after, of course. Charlie grizzled in his cot, and she called through to him in a soft, sing-song voice. "Hey, Charlie. Hey, Charlie Barley. Mummy's here, baby. Mummy's right here." But today it felt automatic, and she had no desire to go through and pick him up and feel the weight of him, safe in her arms, going nowhere. Instead, she sipped her tea quickly at the kitchen window. As she did, she reached into the pouch of her hoodie to get the elastic that she used to keep her hair off her face while she worked. She took it out, along with a piece of white card with a phone number on it. It was only when she turned it over that Anna realized it was the photo of Sandra and her dog, Mitzi. She studied the photo. Sandra's dark roots were showing a bit in the picture, but her makeup was perfect. A long time ago, perfect makeup was something Anna cared about. She used to get free samples at work and try out different looks, hours in front of the mirror applying Cleopatra eyeliner, dabbing at kohl with a makeup sponge, lining her lips so they seemed fuller than they really were. Often while Daniel played on the floor behind her, with bricks or books, entertaining himself while she stared at her own stupid face. It made her clammy with shame. She put the photo down on the counter and stared out of the kitchen window, onto a beautiful garden with curved beds, filled with wrong flowers and not right shrubs, against a backdrop of fuzzy trees. She blinked, and it was gone. Before she could even think about how odd that had been, Anna was overtaken by a desperate need for water. Tea was not enough. She leaned over and turned on the tap so hard that water ricocheted off the sink and sprayed across her t-shirt. Anna didn't care. She was so dry. No time for a glass or a mug or even a cupped hand. She twisted her head under the flow and gulped at the water that hammered out of the spout, greedily sucking it down as it overflowed and ran into her hair and her ear. Once, when Anna was 4 or 5, her mother had bought her a paper lily that was packed tight into a tiny plastic bubble only an inch across. They had run a sink full of water and dropped the little pink knot into it and watched it magically uncurl and blossom into a wonderful flower nearly a foot wide. Anna thought of it now for the first time in years, as she felt the water race through her body like an electrical current, making her alive again when she had been dry and dead and tightly packed. After a few moments, she straightened up a little unsteadily. Her hair dripped onto her shoulders, and she felt light-headed and foolish. She should eat something. She had to think hard about what she had eaten, or when, before the 2 biscuits of the church last night. She got all the way back to a boiled egg for lunch on Thursday. Had she drunk anything since then? She must have. But she couldn't think when. No wonder she was hallucinating. Anna took a slice of bread from the loaf in the fridge and made toast and another cup of tea. She needed to take care of herself. She needed to be here when Daniel came home. And for the first time in months, she felt she was actually doing something to make that happen. Chapter 12. "Would you like a cup of tea, Chief Inspector, and a piece of cake?" Marvel looked up from the pink velour sofa and confirmed the order, and Sandra Clyde bustled off to the kitchen. So, this was where the super lived. Marvel looked around and mentally snorted. Even though Clyde was probably in his mid-50s, only 10 years older than him, he lived in the house of an old fart. There were lace cloths on the side tables, and antimacassars on the backs of the chairs, and a plastic runner in the hallway to protect the carpet. There were photos of babies that Marvel assumed were grandchildren, and of adults he assumed were children, doing expensive things like skiing and climbing that place in Peru with all the bloody steps. There were crap trinkets from foreign holidays, a bonbon dish shaped like a sombrero, and a bull's pizzle twisted into something disgusting you could hang on the wall. The sofa was pink, the carpet was pink, the wallpaper was maroon, which was just dark pink, really. Marvel suddenly wondered why it was that men allowed women to control the way their homes looked. Now that he thought about it, when Debbie had moved in, his stuff had started to move out. His sofa had been the very first thing to go. Marvel had spent many a long, happy night on that sagging dark blue corduroy, sipping whiskey at one end, his feet wearing a hole in the arm at the other, all the while berating the England cricket team as they lost to the Aussies on Sky Sports. But within days of Debbie moving in, it had been replaced by a blocky cream-leather habitat couch. Debbie said it was retro, which meant you couldn't put your feet on it. Then he'd found his lung ashtray in a box she was taking to charity. She'd said it was a mistake, but he'd taken it to work for safekeeping. And then on the night he'd stopped on Bickley Bridge, he'd come home to find his Jameson bar towel collection had disappeared from the coffee table, in favor of 2 red candles and a pale chunk of pink rock on an ornate wooden stand. "Rose quartz opens the heart chakra," she had told him, embarrassingly. "Interesting," he'd said. "Where are my bar towels?" "Under the sink. I hope that's okay." Marvel had stayed quiet while she bent and lit the candles, even though she was right in the way of San Marino versus Belgium. And then he'd said, "What's that smell?" "What smell?" "Like a hippie's armpit." "Patchouli," she'd said, looking crushed. "Why?" he'd asked. "Are we smoking pot now?" Debbie's heart chakra must have snapped shut at that point, because they hadn't had sex that night or for several nights afterwards. A while later he'd realized it had been Valentine's Day. He'd have to make it up to her next year. Sandra Clyde brought tea in a pot on a tray, delicate china cups and a slab of Victoria sponge that would have choked a cart horse. Marvel felt more cultured just holding a cup and saucer, more sensible, older, closer to death. Sandra sat down in the wing chair opposite and looked expectant. It reminded Marvel that there was no such thing as free cake.
"Any news?"
she said, as if he would have kept it from her if he had found Muttley already. No, not Muttley, Mindy. Not Mindy, something like Mindy. Morky, no. Marty, Mandy, Monkey, Mopsy. Shit. He'd forgotten the name of the bloody thing now. He shook his head. Not yet, I'm afraid, but it's early days.
"Mitzi's been gone for 5 weeks,"
said Sandra, a little reproachfully. Early days for the official investigation, soothed Marvel. He took out his notebook and wrote Mitzi in big letters on the first blank page, so that he wouldn't forget it again. Then Sandra told him everything she'd done to try to find the dog since it had disappeared in the park. She'd printed photos and flyers and bumper stickers. She'd got her grandson to upload Mitzi's picture to the internet. She'd put cards in newsagents' windows and offered a reward. Reward?
£1,000, she nodded. "No questions asked."
Marvel tutted. We don't encourage that, he said. In fact, we don't approve of it at all. I'm surprised the super allowed it.
You don't approve of offering a reward?
Saying no questions asked, said Marvel. It confuses the investigation and could be seen as an obstruction of justice.
What do you mean?
How many calls have you had about Mitzi since putting up the cards?
Oh, lots. Everyone wants to help.
£1,000 buys a lot of so-called help, said Marvel. Especially when there are no questions asked. If the dog was nicked, then the criminals feel safer about bringing it back for the reward because they reckon you won't be calling the police. You see? Sandra got all flustered at that, and Marvel put up a hand to wave the issue away. What's done is done. We'll let it go.
Thank you very much, Chief Inspector, she said.
No problem, said Marvel magnanimously. He filed it away, though, for future reference. It was minor, but minor things could become major things, especially for people in positions of responsibility, like police superintendents. What kind of police officer wouldn't ask questions? It would be a dereliction of duty not to. Now, he said seriously, I understand you've consulted a psychic.
Oh, yes, said Sandra. He's been very helpful, too.
Has he found Mitzi?
Well, no, not yet.
Then he hasn't been that helpful, has he? Said Marvel.
Well, he has, said Sandra a little defensively. He's told me not to give up hope, and that Mitzi will be home soon.
And how has that been helpful?
Well, she said again, it's given me hope, you see?
I'm sure it has, agreed Marvel. But what if it's false hope? Sandra Clyde's face crumpled.
You mean Mitzi might be dead?
No. Shit, he didn't want her crying. He didn't want to make the super's wife cry. How in hell was that going to help his chance of promotion? No, that's not what I meant, said Marvel. Not at all. I only mean that if somebody is desperate, like you are, to find... He glanced at his notebook. Mitzi, sometimes that hope, that completely valid hope, can be abused by an unscrupulous person.
Oh, he's not unscrupulous, Chief Inspector. I was very careful. He's not some fly-by-night. He's even helped the police on a case. That's how I knew his name. Richard's been on TV and everything.
Richard Latham? Said Marvel with a heavy heart.
Yes, nodded Sandra Clyde eagerly. Do you know him?
Not personally, said Marvel. But I worked on the Edie Evans case. And I have to tell you, Mrs. Clyde, that he was really no help at all to us. None whatsoever. A year on and Edie's still missing. All Mr. Latham did was waste police time and possibly distract us from what might have been more fruitful lines of inquiry. Sandra looked crestfallen all over again. Have you paid him any money? Marvel asked.
Oh, no, she said instantly. Only some little donations for the church roof."
Marvel grunted and reddened and pretended to write something in his notebook while he gathered his thoughts. The church roof. It sounded so stupid. It was so stupid, and it made him furious to think that he and Sandra Clyde had that stupidity in common. The coincidence knocked the schadenfreude right out of Marvel, so instead of being scathing, he just said weakly, "Well, don't give him any more, okay?"